Hello everyone, Rob B here with Rob D, and you are listening to the Property Podcast. Now this week, we're going to be looking at inflation and deflation. No, not of my waistline over lockdown. It's actually much more important. In fact, it's so important that every property investor must understand what it is and how it impacts you, but most don't.
Welcome to the Property Podcast, where every Thursday property investors come to be informed and inspired. Are we heading into a period of inflation or a period of deflation? It's one of the biggest topics of our time, and you've probably already read and heard people talk about this, and you've probably heard some contradictory opinions. Well, in this week's episode and next week's, we're not just going to give you our views, we're going to help you understand inflation and deflation, and also, importantly, understand how it can affect you as an investor. And make sure you stick around for Hub Extra at the end, where we'll be sharing more resources that will help you build on your understanding. For our news story this week, we've got some really interesting data from HomeTrack. HomeTrack is a monthly report that we frequently talk about when new data comes out, which looks at 20 cities across the UK and how prices there have changed. What they've done this time, and I think they do once or twice a year, is they broaden it out and they show data from all 65 cities that they keep an eye on, rather than just the 20 that they report on regularly. So you start seeing data for these places where you don't normally see city level results. Unfortunately, it's just a PDF that they send out by email if you subscribe. So we can't link you to this, but we can talk about some patterns in the data. And there are a couple that really jump out. One of them is areas in the south that previously had performed strongly are starting to struggle. So there's only 3 towns that they've tracked which have actually fallen in value over the last year, which is Aberdeen, Oxford and Grimsby. But there are others that are doing relatively poorly. So Milton Keynes has done 0 growth, Southampton 0.2, Luton 0.4, Reading 0.8. And these are areas that previously had done very well. The reason for that, I assume, is that this is kind of a reverse ripple from London. So London had very strong growth early in the cycle, and as the ripple effect tells us, that tends to lift areas that are nearby. So it will spread out across London from the prime areas and then into the suburbs, the commuter belt and so on. So those areas that I just listed had done well as a result of that. Now London has started to struggle, and prices in some parts of London have been falling, others have been stagnant. Those areas, by extension, are starting to struggle as well. And you can see the ripple effect working in the opposite direction in the satellite towns of cities that have done particularly well recently.
You certainly can. It's almost the opposite has happened. So further north, you've had places like Manchester and Nottingham doing really well. Liverpool's starting to do well also, along with Leeds. But what's really interesting now is for the first time we're seeing satellite areas or satellite towns around these major cities also starting to move. So possibly surprisingly for most people, except possibly if you live there, top of the table out of all 60 is Rochdale, which has seen growth of 4.8% over the last 12 months. Bear in mind the type of 12 months we've just had. That's pretty incredible, really strong numbers there. But there's also notable mentions for Birkenhead, which is just outside of Liverpool, which has also seen strong growth. Bolton, which is just outside of Manchester, also featuring in the top 10. And Mansfield, just outside of Nottingham. So all these areas that we talk about on the podcast that are doing really well are now starting to ripple out to the surrounding areas. Something you would expect to see, but possibly slightly surprising it's started already. Now, does that mean you should forget about these cities and move into these ripple areas? No, not at all. Places like Liverpool and Nottingham have got a long way in terms of growth yet. And if you buy well in Manchester, you'd expect from the cycle to see more growth there still to come. But what is really interesting is those satellite areas starting to move. I think it's worth saying though, if you're starting to get excited and thinking about moving into one of those areas to invest in now, it's probably easier to get it wrong in one of those areas. In a city, you're protected by strong fundamentals, and those areas we've mentioned, of course, do have them as well, but less so. So it's not to say don't invest in those areas if this tempts you, but make sure you do your research with a bit of research sprinkles on top to make sure you get it right. Because in those areas, you just have to be a little bit sharper and make sure you're buying in the best place in those areas rather than an average place.
Now, it's worth noting that this data only goes up to and including April. It was released in May. So it doesn't include all of the lockdown period. And Also, we don't know what's going to happen next in the market. We don't know what the next year or so is going to look like, really. But what matters isn't looking at what's happened in a particular area, then assuming that you can project it forward in some way, because things can and do change. What matters is the principle, because you can apply that principle anytime, anywhere. So the ripple effect, like the property cycle, is one of those ideas that we keep coming back to because it keeps on being useful and it keeps having predictive value. And this data is just another example of that in action. Are we heading into a period of inflation or deflation? That's a question that should be occupying part of your mind as a property investor, because it's going to have a significant impact on how your investments perform. Now, this is a big topic, so we're going to tackle it in two parts. Next week, we're going to talk about the last 10 years or so since the financial crash, what's happened since then, and as a result, what's likely to happen in the future and what that'll mean for you. Before we can get into that, though, we need to build up a good base of understanding about what inflation and deflation are and the different forces that are at play in the economy that can create one or the other. So if you're coming into this with very little understanding about what inflation and deflation are, don't worry at all. We're going to build up your knowledge right from the beginning, starting with the very basic question of what is inflation?
Well, inflation is an increase in the price of goods and services over time. So let's look at a simple example. Let's take a pint of milk. Now, a pint of milk hasn't changed much over the years, but the prices have. So, for example, in 1971, milk cost roughly about 5 pence. Now, today, it costs roughly around 46 pence. Now, milk hasn't got more expensive to produce. It's actually, if anything, got cheaper. The difference in price, that increase, is all down to inflation. So, inflation causes goods and services to increase in price over time. It's also important to point out that you also have wage inflation. The average wage today compared to 1971 is much higher. And again, a lot of that is just down to inflation. So don't worry too much if you think, oh wow, everything's gone up in price, because your wages would have gone up as well.
So milk costs more, as does everything else. You're earning more. So what's the point? Why does any of this matter? And what's causing it anyway? Well, we'll get into the reasons for inflation later. But a quick way of thinking about it for now is not that everything is getting more expensive. It's that the value of a unit of currency, the value of the pound, is getting lower. So you could say that you could exchange an hour of your working time for the same amount of goods that you could before. It's the currency itself that has changed. It's a weird concept to grasp, but we'll get into the detail of that later. It's also worth saying that a reason that this happens is that the government likes this happening. The Bank of England has an explicit target to keep inflation at around 2% a year. One of the reasons for that is that they want to avoid deflation, and we'll talk about what that is and why they want to avoid it later on.
And this is one of the reasons why property investors really should love inflation. Many don't understand why it benefits them, but don't worry. If you don't know, here's a quick recap. Property prices tend to go up at least in line with inflation, and often a bit more. In fact, since the early 1970s, property has outperformed inflation by nearly 2% on average each year. But even if property prices were aligned with inflation, then you're still onto a winner, because inflation is basically eroding the value of your money. So, if you have a property that was worth 200,000 and your debt on that property is 100,000. So you've taken a mortgage out for £100,000. In time, your property may be worth £400,000. And if you've had an interest-only mortgage for the entire time you've owned the property, your debt would still be 100,000. So nothing's happened to your debt, right? Well, no, that's not true. Because as we've already learned, the value of that money will have decreased over time. Let's say that took 10 years to occur. £100,000 10 years ago is worth a lot less today, and that's because of inflation. So with property, you have an asset that outperforms inflation, and you have inflation then devaluing the mechanism for you to buy that property. So you've got a win-win. So property looks very attractive when you account for inflation, and of course that doesn't even take into account rent.
No, rent also tends to go up in line with inflation. Rent is determined by wages, and wages tend to go up with inflation, and they tend to do so quite smoothly. Whereas property values have outpaced inflation over the long term, they've certainly not done so smoothly. There's been booms, there's been crashes, there's been all sorts going on. But rents have just steadily, in general, ticked up in line with inflation. Why shouldn't they? It's something that people pay for, no different from a pint of milk. So as an investor, you've got an asset where the value is over the long term going up at least in line with inflation, You've got a debt that inflation is stealthily eroding, and you've got an income stream that's maintaining its value because that rent is going up in line with inflation. Now, that's a very brief overview of what inflation is and why it's a powerful concept for investors to understand. If that was a bit too quick for you, or you just want to learn more, we've got a couple of really useful resources to check out. So back in episode 309 of the podcast, we recorded an episode all about inflation. We'll link to that in the show notes. And we'll also link to a course that we've done completely free on Property Hub University called Why Property Will Make You Rich in the Long Term. And one of those long-term factors at play is inflation. So inflation happens slowly, you might not notice it, but it's there. It's really important to understand. But it's not the only force, and it's not inevitable that you'll get inflation, because there's also its opposite that's very important to understand, which is deflation.
Yep, so if inflation is goods and services increasing in cost and value, deflation is the opposite. It's when general price levels in a country are falling. Deflation can be caused by a number of different things, and we're going to get onto the causes shortly. But I think it's worth saying that most people, economists and governments, fear deflation. And that's because there are consequences when deflation occurs. So, for example, if you are thinking about making a purchase, but you expect deflation to occur, you may be tempted to hold off making that purchase. So if you're looking at buying a car and you think, well, actually that car may be 2% cheaper in 12 months' time, then you will hold back your spending. And it wouldn't only be you, it'd be everybody. And if everybody holds back their spending, then a snowball effect occurs where deflation is only increased. But a consequence then, that car manufacturer will make less money. And if they make less money, then they can't afford to employ as many people. And then you have unemployment. And then you also have wage deflation. Now, this isn't all guaranteed, but this could play out. And because it could play out, there aren't any governments out there who are actively trying to encourage deflation. Although there are some economists out there who do argue the case for deflation and believe it's a good thing. So bad deflation, as we touched on, is when demand falls faster than any growth, because that can cause negative money shocks like what happened in the Great Depression. It created a bad deflation. People held off spending and the problem magnified. But good deflation occurs when the supply of goods outstrip the average demand, and this can be from the result of advances in technology or improved productivity. Now, don't worry if that doesn't make a lot of sense to you right now, because we're going to go into deflationary forces and you can understand why some of them may be seen as positive. Now, the reason why property investors don't like deflation? Well, asset values drop. So the price of your home, your property, is likely going to fall down as well with all the other goods and services. And if you've got debt against that property, and that's a fixed debt, then that magical inflation scenario is reversed. Your debt is pegged at a value while everything else is falling in price. For property investors, that wouldn't be a great scenario.
So now we understand what inflation and deflation are, we can get a bit more into what causes them. And an important thing to understand is it's never one or the other. There are always multiple forces at work, some of which are inflationary and some of which are deflationary. And whether you see inflation or deflation overall depends on which set of forces is stronger. So let's talk about what some of those forces are. Many of them apply equally at all points in history, but some are specific to the time that we find ourselves in now. So we'll talk about some of the most potentially important deflationary and inflationary forces that are taking place right now, so we can then, when we get to our episode next week, start to understand which is most likely to play out in the future. Let's start with deflationary forces, forces that can cause the price of goods and services to fall over time. One of those forces is unemployment. That's fairly straightforward. If people are unemployed, they're not going to be able to spend as much. That's going to reduce demand. Therefore, you've got the same amount of supply, less demand for it, so naturally, prices are going to have to fall in order for those goods and services to be sold. That's simple supply and demand. You can have the same effect take place even without unemployment, even if people's psychology changes and they're suddenly more interested in saving than they were in spending. So this is something that could be taking place right now. Even if people haven't lost their jobs, they might be more concerned about losing their jobs, or they might just be feeling more vulnerable in general than they were and wanting to save more money and cut back on their spending. If that happens, exactly the same mechanism takes place as it did with unemployment. Another deflationary force that we've got right now is an aging population. And again, this is all the same basic supply and demand mechanism. As people get older, they tend to spend less. At the moment, we've got a very large cohort of people, the baby boomers, moving into retirement and then into old age. So all that spending and all that demand that they've been creating in their prime earning and spending years is now going to some extent, fall away. So again, that's a deflationary force.
Another deflationary force is technology. So think about your TV. If you purchased it a few years ago, if you went into the shop today with less money, you get a better TV. That's deflation at work. And it's not just TVs, it applies to a lot of technology. As advancements are made, costs come down. The price of commodities decreasing can cause deflation. So oil, if oil prices drop, then the cost to make certain products also drops. The cost to fly could potentially drop as well. Flights today are much cheaper than they were 30 years ago. And there are many other examples of deflation in place as well. You only have to look at businesses like Uber, who have brought down the price of taxi travel, but have also arguably decreased wages. And that causes deflation. So deflation is all around us. So while we have inflation year on year, there are deflationary forces everywhere. And you see them every day. You see them, but you may not notice them. And the reason you don't notice them is because there's so much inflation. And inflation balances things out.
So what inflationary forces are at play? Some are just the opposite of deflationary forces. So Rob mentioned oil prices being low. If, on the other hand, oil prices are high, that's inflationary because it costs more to make goods. We also talked about unemployment as a deflationary force. Well, the opposite is true as well. If you're getting close to full employment, then that means companies are going to have to pay more to get the employees they want. That means those employees have more money to spend, they're going after the same quantity of goods and services, and we get the law of supply and demand again. The price of those goods and services goes up. There's also the reverse psychological shift from the one I mentioned earlier. I said that at the moment, people might be worried about losing their jobs and therefore be more interested in saving than on spending, which is deflationary. But the opposite could be true as well. People who don't lose their jobs at the moment are going to be in a better cash position than they were before because they've continued to earn the same, but their spending has decreased because there's nothing to spend money on. They don't have to commute to work. They can't go on their holidays. So as a result, these people are in a better financial position than they were. Now, on the face of it, this could be deflationary because it sounds like suppliers are going to have to cut their prices to tempt these people to spend money again. And that might be the case. And we'll get into the relative strengths of these different factors in part 2. But because at the moment supply of all these goods and services has also fallen, and it's going to take time to get all that supply back online again, in the meantime, you've got more money chasing fewer goods, therefore inflation. And there are other forces as well. One of them is a trend towards nationalism. And when people hear nationalism, they sometimes get certain images in their head about what's happened historically with nationalism. But all it means in this context is the opposite of globalization. So more things being produced domestically, less in the way of global supply chains. Globalization has been a deflationary force in that it's been possible to get goods produced more cheaply. Now, for political reasons and practical reasons, it's possible that more will be done domestically. Those are good reasons, but cost is not one of those reasons. It's going to be more expensive to produce goods that way, therefore inflationary. So these are all powerful forces. But Rob, we haven't yet talked about the most powerful of all.
Yeah, the biggie is QE, quantitative easing. And that's the increase of money supply. When you put more money into the system, it devalues what's there because you had an amount of money and then you put more in, well, then it's worth less. And that causes inflation because it's spent. More people spend that money because there's more of it, and that pushes up asset prices and other goods and services prices. So quantitative easing, which started after 2008, has been the real driver of inflation over the last decade or so. And more recently, we've seen QE been implemented in a big way. So another big driver towards inflation. That is huge. But I think what's possibly as big, if not bigger, are the people behind QE, the government and the Bank of England. Because governments want inflation. And the reason they want inflation is for the same reason property investors like inflation, is that their debt is devalued. And particularly when you have a lot of debt, like we do right now, then governments only have a limited amount of tools to clear that debt. And one of the few tools that they have left is to inflate their way out of it. So when the government, who controls our money supply through the Bank of England, are incentivized to create inflation, well, guess what? They're going to do all they can to create inflation. So that's why, for decades, we've had inflation. So you have deflationary forces at play, but you have more inflationary forces at play, which means that through the majority of history, we've seen more inflation than we have deflation.
So we now know what inflation is and what deflation is. And we've seen that even though it happens very slowly, it's highly unusual to see prices rocketing or plummeting because of inflation or deflation. There are actually a lot of forces at play. Some dragging prices down and others lifting them up. It's like a tug of war, and which side is stronger determines whether you end up with inflation or deflation. We've also seen why governments like inflation and fear deflation, and why property investors should feel the same way. So as a property investor, it's very important to understand which of these we're likely to see in the future. Are we going to see stronger inflation than we've seen in recent memory, or are we going to see deflation for the first time in a long time? Because of the coronavirus and because of the global response to the coronavirus, you could argue it either way. You could point to stronger deflationary forces than we've seen in our lifetimes, but you could also potentially point to stronger inflationary forces than we've ever seen before at any point in history. Which side will end up winning? Well, that is what we're going to be talking about next week.
Now it's time for our listeners' success stories. And you know what? This one technically isn't a success story, but I just really enjoyed the effort that went into this iTunes review. So the effort is a success. This came in from Brett. And Brett said, Rob and Rob have built the foundations of a wonderful, inspiring podcast, furnished it with amazing information, and finished it off with a high spec of calm and balanced commentary on the ever-changing, compelling buy-to-let market. If podcasts were property, this would be in a prime location with stunning infrastructure and the best home on the street. Well, thank you, Brett. I salute the effort that you went to, not only to leave us a 5-star review, which is awesome, thank you, but also the effort that you went to when leaving that review. So thank you. And if you're enjoying the show, please do leave us a review on iTunes or on Google reviews, wherever's easiest for you. We do appreciate it. Or if you find an iTunes a bit fiddly, you can try a Google review or even Trustpilot. I promise you, we read them all, and thank you to everybody who continues to leave them. So it's time for Hub Extra, where we like to give you a little bit more. Now remember, if you like this part of the show, you must sign up for our Friday newsletter via the Property Hub website. It's completely free, no catches, and each and every week we send out an email on Friday, trying to make it the most valuable email you get in your inbox each week. But on the show, we want to help you build on your knowledge even further. So we talked about inflation this week. And when people understand how it impacts them as a property investor, it's amazing how people's worldview of investing changes. And that's why we've done a whole episode on that very subject. It was part of a series of podcasts we did called February Fundamentals. And it was a 4-parter series where we looked at the fundamentals of property investment. Now, episode 309 was when we covered inflation. So you definitely want to go and listen to that one. But go and listen to the series of 4 podcasts, because whether you're a professional or a newbie, refreshing your knowledge on these core concepts can really help you level up. So we'll link to it in the show notes, but if you want to shoot over there straight away, check out episode 309.
So that is us done for this week. What an episode that was. I hope you found it useful. Maybe your brain's spinning a little bit, but we've given you some more resources there in Hub Extra to help you really solidify this in your brain. And having done that, you'll want to join us again for the Property Podcast next Thursday, when we'll be getting into part 2. But before then, of course, we'll see you for Ask Rob and Rob on Tuesday. So until then, take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.